Hello and welcome back to Raised by Giants, where we talk all things spirituality. I am Ryder Lee, and I am joined by an amazing group of people here, very honorable and trustworthy, to have a very grounded conversation and realistic conversation, roundtable discussion that I don't believe has ever been done before. And it's an honor and a privilege to introduce our panel members here today. Ladies first, with MK Ultra Monarch survivor at a White House Pentagon level whose congressional testimony was censored under national security in 1995. Her book, Transformation of America, also published in 95 with intelligence insider Mark Phillips, outlines exactly what took place. Cathy O'Brien, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Great. I'm looking forward to this discussion. This is going to be fun today.
Thank you. It's lovely to have you. Next, we have former U.S. Army Intelligence Security Command and Defense Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Science and Technology, top secret psychic spy, remote viewer with a master in military art and science degree, a master's degree in administration, and a doctorate in education, the author of many books, including bestseller Psychic Warrior, Dr. David Morehouse. Welcome back to the show. How are you?
Good to be here.
It's an honor and a privilege to have you, my friend. Next panel guest has been employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as an inactive reserve officer in the U.S. Air Force, for which he served as a special agent for the AFOSI while on active duty, and then worked as a counterterrorism operational consultant for 6 years following military service. He is an author, researcher, writer, and investigator. His books, Empire of the Wheel and Shimmering Light, Lost in MK Ultra, House of Anu, will give you a completely different perspective on certain topics and events. Walter Bosley, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Thanks for having me on. And in this group, I'm definitely low man on the totem pole as far as knowledge of this topic. So I'm really glad to be here with the other two guests, I'll tell you.
No, I insist. I'm the low man. Sort of pulling it.
I think the knowledge of this whole panel is completely astounding, and I've had you all on my show several times now, and I thought it would be interesting and fitting to bring you all together for what's going to be, I think, a very enlightening conversation. And feel free to ask each other questions throughout the discussion as well. So as for the reason for putting this together is I believe very strongly through researching the CIA MK Ultra program, studying the DIA Army intelligence psychic programs, and from my research into the ET and UFO phenomenon, I believe these things are all interconnected on very deep levels that many wouldn't really expect. So with that in mind, Cathy, was extraterrestrials, UFOs, or aliens or anything of that nature ever mentioned to you in the MK Ultra Monarch program?
Well, in several ways. The first way, there's an alien themed program that's would discredit a survivor or something, and you have to deprogram the program first and get down to it and find out what it was really all about. So there was a very deliberate misinformation, alien theme program intended to make me feel like I was totally helpless and that there was nothing I could do about the situation. And then on another end of things, it was like George Bush talking about aliens at Bohemian Grove with his friends. It's just they're sitting around talking and discussing information that way. And they were tossing around ideas that aliens are us in the future, that they've come back through time, that it's actually a time travel type thing with dimensional aspects to it. So that's completely different than the alien programming. And, that's not a very intelligent thing for them to have done, kind of brain jam their mind control, MK Ultra mind control theme. But the conversations were really interesting and thought provoking. And I think there's still a lot more possibility than just that. But something to consider when we hear survivors coming forward, are they part of the MK Ultra alien theme, or is there something that they actually know? there's so much possibility out there.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to really dive into here today. Dave, what about you? Was there any supposed non-human intelligences ever mentioned to you, or were you ever asked to remote view something of this nature within the DIA or Army Intelligence Stargate program?
Yeah, there were what were called historical off-planet targets that were looked at. And by historical, it meant that they would not frequently, but let's say maybe once a quarter, maybe more often. But the idea was to pull one of these old off-planet targets, or some of them were called open search outward targets. And the theory behind an open search outward target was that there was a way in which you could use a Cartesian system to divide up a particular segment of the visible universe. I mean, that was the idea, that you could, the concept of the target would be the visible universe, and then from the visible universe, using a Cartesian system to cut that down to, something might be, it might be X-ray 55, Yankee 62, Zulu 14, and that would give you a square of the universe. And then they could further divide that down, and then further divide that down, so that the concept of the target then would be fairly well defined, but still a very large area that we couldn't actually physically measure. And then, but that would be the concept of the target to which the coordinates would be assigned. And then the open search out would be to take 8 viewers and then send them like a shotgun blast into that particular area, and something should be perceivable. I mean, the idea was, if you could get correlation between 5 of the 8 where they would hit something or stumble on something and then talk about it, and come up with a verbal and the visual sensory data to support their experience in that target. If there was good correlation of data, that target would then get a date and its number, and it would be held in a folder and would be part of the historical record of off-planet targets. So maybe later, maybe a year later, as viewers changed around, they might bring that target back out again and have people work that target to see if there was continued correlation of the data relative to that particular target. So they would do that. And I worked those targets in the 3 years I was there, probably 6, 7, maybe 8 times. And they were always interesting. But the thing you have to remember is you have to take all of that with a bit of a grain, right? Because there's no positive feedback for that. You have no idea whether that's real or not. One has to kind of fall back to the kind of the Drake equation, and from Frank Drake, and say that one would have to be an absolute lunatic to assume that there would not be in the known universe, that there would not be amongst all of the trillions of galaxies that are out there, that there would not be a solar system that could support other life. The problem with the Drake equation is that it asks for habitable zones, for us to consider habitable zones within our own galaxy, meaning habitable zones from a perspective of human beings being able to inhabit that place. Well, what if this alien life form, exists within methane or within some other substance, they don't breathe there, or some other thing? So I think it's ridiculous to assume that the only kind of intelligent life that might be out there would have to be life similar to us. It would certainly does not need to be. And so it could all of those things are possible, and all of them highly probable. And the fact that remote viewers were being used to look at that and then report on it, and it became part of the historical record from that unit, said to me that I was very clear. If I wasn't clear before, I was very clear at that point that we're not alone in the universe, not alone in the galaxy, and the ability of alien life to transit the galaxy clearly cannot just simply have, the cosmological constant of the speed of light applied to that ability to transit. They, of course, would, nothing can go out and take 44,000 years to go out and 44,000 to come back at, light years. They certainly have, when we say advanced, they are certainly more advanced than us. And any of the stuff that's ever been done by viewers looking at these kinds of things talks about skyways. They talk about portals. They talk about openings. They talk about all kinds of different things, indicating that these vehicles and these life forms go from one place to another, not by just simply a straight line azimuth across the galaxy or the universe, but kind of adding to what Cathy was talking about, it's a dimensional prospect. They have an ability to enter a portal, transit, and it come right straight back out of another portal, and maybe they're in another dimension, or maybe they're just now at that point in doing that, they're across the galaxy, where we're thinking in such rudimentary terms. We're thinking, geez, how long would it take to motor across the galaxy, even if we could travel at the speed of light, which is just foolish, in my opinion, if you're trying to look at stuff like that. So anyway, long answer to your question, but yeah, they did do that.
Really quickly before I jump to Walter to get his thoughts. Did they ever have you view any non-intelligence life on Earth? Because from my understanding, Skip Atwater gave these coordinates or these locations of 4 alien bases on the Earth that Pat Price previously remote viewed, and then apparently gave that to the unit at Fort Meade and had the other remote viewers in the unit also view those alien bases. Is this true or no?
I really can't answer that question. I don't know. I looked at every file in all. I think there were 6 or 8 file safes, 4-drawer file safes, 24 inches. They were safes, 24 inches wide, like 32 inches deep, 4 drawers, and you had to spin the dial and open them up every morning. And I looked at every file in every safe during the time I was there. Why? Call me curious. I just figured I wanted to do it, which means I saw every session, everything that anybody did, which is why I kind of scoffed when some people talk about how great they were as remote viewers, because I saw everything that everybody did. So you're not gonna pull the wool over my eyes. So what I can say is I know that I worked a project with Ed Dames and Mel Riley that generated some interest, and it had to do with suspected underground locations, although I never developed any underground target data, but Mel and Ed did, and perhaps others did as well, if the target was being worked with other people beside myself. There was a degree of compartmentalization in the unit. I didn't always know what everybody else was working, and that was because it was being controlled by Fern Gavin, the GS-15. And, he would task people with things and not necessarily share with everybody else what he had tasked you to do. But he was the person that was assigning coordinates based on his concept of targets or based on an intelligent customer's request for information. But in this particular ilk of targets, talking about our genre of targets, talking about alien bases and alien vehicles and alien life forms, civilizations, locations, I don't know who he was talking to generate that kind of intelligence. I'm assuming that it would have been somebody at DIA, DT-S, maybe Dr. Jack Verona, the chief scientist of DIA, maybe somebody beyond that, because remember, we were under the oversight of the Central Intelligence Agency, and that never left. There was always a degree of them keeping their finger on the pulse of that organization to figure out what it was doing and how well or not that it was doing it. And I do not know if they had that kind of contact with the Air Force and the Navy programs, or what else they were doing with SRI International. But I know that they did for us. I mean, that acronym was routinely mentioned in the organization. So I don't know if I know we did the Chaco Canyon, and I know we did some other stuff, but and they were pretty important, and they actually generated a response by a research organization that went to Chaco Canyon and set up like 4 or 5 big white research vans and pulled out all their gear to try to measure anomalous activity, and were there for quite a while and shut the park down. And that happened about 6 months after we submitted our final report to Fern. So that's really my only proof that he probably was sending that information to someone. And it only passes kind of the logic test that might be the reason why we kept these files, these historical files. And I think if you hear anybody that's in that unit turn around and say that they didn't do that, then that person is probably trying to protect a security clearance still, or trying to stay in the good graces of the agency, whereas I am not. So I will tell you anything that I know about that organization.
Thanks so much, Dave.
The other organization.
Yes, appreciate you. Walter, what about you through your intelligence and military service in the Air Force? Anyone ever mention UFOs or extraterrestrials?
Oh, yeah. My mentor, what's interesting is he would tell me the most extraordinary things within those categories. Never on base, never at a government facility was I told these things. It was always outside that. In fact, sometimes we would take a drive out in the middle of the countryside before he would tell me certain things, or we'd be walking around the block after midnight, or, you know, in his neighborhood. And excuse me, the way he would, you know, that and the things he would tell me, you know, this was, I assume still today that this was the culpable deniability part. You know, should I, you know, kind of go rogue and start running my mouth, you know, in the wrong places, it would be easily deniable, right? Now, not that, and David probably knows well this part, there were security level briefings I got in the Air Force, which were certainly, how do we put it? The language of those and the nature of the briefings are generic in a way that as you learn details of classified information and classified technology, you begin to better interpret what you were actually briefed on in your security level briefing. You realize, oh, okay, I was assuming they were talking about a satellite. They were talking about something else when you're getting your security briefing, watching these things on the screen, you know, as you're getting your tickets, you're getting briefed in on your ticket levels. So the things he told me, I also, a few years later, started seeing parts of this emerge in our UFO community. And, you know, I came away with, okay, some of this is sprinkled into disinformation, or some of this people heard the same stuff I heard, and they're taking advantage of that in the UFO community. For example, something like Serpo. I was told in the mid-90s, for example, that there were 6, this was one of those late night conversations, that there were 6 civilizations we were in contact with. And we had personnel on orbital stations who were in kind of an exchange program to learn, you know, just to learn about their civilization, their operations. But this was something that was orbital. And then a few years later, we hear about this Serpo thing, which really obviously is something somebody pulled from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, probably married it up with whatever was actually going on. And there you go. You have a full-blown disinformation program right there. Yeah, the way I was told things was the wildest things, right? Was always in an unofficial capacity, I think, so it could be culpably denied. But I was told, but what I loved hearing about what both Dr. Morehouse and what Cathy were saying was I That's the nature of what I was hearing. The things about portals, the things about the ET theme, really, and I agree with Cathy on that. I do think that a lot of the ET experience, the legitimate stuff, I think, is definitely a MK Ultra type of filter. What do they call it? The false narrative, right? I think this was done to my dad, as you know. I wrote that in my book. Yeah, I've heard these pieces of these same things or things like that. I'm very familiar with those drawer safes that David was talking about. So that made me flash back to my last assignment in the Air Force when it was my job as branch chief to open those things up every morning and close them every night. So yeah, that's been my experience. Is they find a way to tell you the wildest things in the capacity I worked in, the context I worked in as an agent. They find the way to communicate the wildest things to you in that way that, you can't prove it. Like I can't prove to you the things I was told, but.
Now, Walter, do we have any proof or evidence, even verifiable stories that the Air Force was running any kind of MK Ultra experiments?
That dates back to the 50s. Within the historical research on MK Ultra, the CIA did indeed bring the military branches in, and they reported the documentation, the history reports that among the military branches, the Air Force was particularly turned on and enthused by MK Ultra. The Army pursued it, of course, and the Navy to whatever extent. But the interesting thing about the Air Force is they were the branch that ran off and did their independent research on MK Ultra. That's at least how it's presented in the history, the known history of MK Ultra. So, I've always argued that, but, in 1973, 74, the church committees made the CIA come clean to some extent. And that revealed, I think, some of what they were doing with the Army and stuff. But we've never had the U.S. Air Force made to come clean about what they've been doing with MK Ultra for what now? 70 years, 60 years.
Yeah. If I may, the Air Force was tremendously concerned about it. They were concerned because Air Force had the highest likelihood of being captured by enemy forces.
Yep.
And so survival, escape, evasion, and resistance was a huge issue, particularly for the Air Force. Elements of Army aviation, which were kind of in their fledgling at that point, because remember, there wasn't even a U.S. Air Force during World War II. It existed following World War II. So Army aviation was now putting on blue uniforms, and there really wasn't a strong development of Army aviation. And the idea that ground forces in combat would end up with individuals that could then be, interrogated and brainwashed and those kinds of things, that was on a lower priority scale, because if you had somebody shoot down whatever kind of bomber system or nuclear bomber system, and you were then capturing people, then there were things you could get out of Air Force personnel that you wouldn't be able to get out of ground forces. And maybe it would have only been an issue, as they developed their fighters, the Navy aviation as fighters off carriers. And even then, that wasn't even considered to be, because they weren't typically carrying nuclear arsenals. They were carrying ground tactical, close air support kinds of stuff to work in support of Marines or others. So, so your service had the most to lose, and therefore the most interest in developing a program to strengthen the mind. Because in those days, remember, it was name, rank, and serial number, which usually caused you to be horribly tortured.
Yes.
In order to, and everybody had a breaking point. No, there's nobody that was tortured that I know of or have ever read about that. And they told me that when I did at SEER School and Rangers, they had that in Ranger School back in the day. They kind of stopped it the next year, but they just used to beat the living crap out of you as best they could without, crossing a line. And the idea was, you learned that you could fight it as long for a certain amount of time, but they were going to break you down. And it may take you 3 days. It might take them 3 months. It might take them 3 years. But when you get to this point of you understand you're hopeless, and they're just going to keep doing it until you tell them something. And then the big mantra was in those days that you couldn't tell them anything more than name, rank, and serial number. Now they tell you, make shit up.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
lie. Make something up,
Yeah.
Oh, I belong to, the Space Force. Didn't you guys hear? I'm now working for the Space Force. So
I think what you're talking about too, we would probably, if you measured it, you would probably see a greater understanding and appreciation for compartmentalization once they realized, hey, everybody breaks, right? So let's make even more certain that they only have a little piece of the pie, because they're only going to be able to give up their piece at worst.
Exactly. That was what I knew in MK Ultra too, and you guys have described so well the how trauma is a basis of mind control, and the reason that the alien theme was used, especially like the lizard alien theme programming, is because a primitive part of the brain was always terrified of reptiles. It goes back into our survival instinct in the earliest, our earliest days. We were afraid of snakes and whatever. So they went with the lizard theme because it went into the primitive mind so deep. Plus it goes kind of biblical because the serpent, and so they could use a crossover of it. So it was very deliberate that they used that as a trauma base in order to create that sense of helplessness and the compartmentalization. So in my experience, being programmed on various military and NASA installations, to me, perceptually, the highest level of MK Ultra and the highest level of actual extreme intelligence would have been DARPA. And I wonder if that was any part of what you were exposed to.
Well, I can say that my mentor, when he retired with 44 years in the intelligence community. He started in Army Special Forces in the early 50s. When he had me go put my first application in to the U.S. government. Now, remember who I ended up working for: the FBI, then the Air Force, OSI, and then for some other guys in counterterrorism. My first application, he instructed me specifically. I went back there to visit him. He instructed me to drive up to the Redstone Arsenal, go to a particular back door of one of the NASA buildings, and there was a guy waiting. I knocked on the door, had my my application form, and he knew my name. He took the application, and that was the last direct overt contact I had with NASA. But during my FBI background investigation a year later, there were two sets of agents, one from the FBI, another one from another organization, that were doing my background. So I've always been intrigued with, gee, why did he have my first application go to NASA? So I've always been intrigued with that. Never got a direct answer.
That makes sense.
So, Cathy, you just mentioned DARPA. Were there any other companies or organizations or three-letter agencies or military branch that was involved with running your program?
Well, NASA and DARPA were significant in all of it. But aside from that, I think they just used whatever location was convenient, whether it was an Army base or an Air Force base or whatever it would be. It didn't seem to matter as much as long as they had the technology that they were wanting, or whoever. Like my primary programmer was Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, the founder of the occult temple is set on our military bases in the Army, but there wasn't any place he wouldn't show up because he had that ability to go in between. So for me, it was very much a blurred line. And then there were places too that were outside of any particular agency. You know, when you have like the Mount Shasta operation and Swiss Villa Amphitheater, Bohemian Grove, you know, wherever those particular places where there was also that aspect too. So there's a lot of different places that were involved in. There's not one that was more prevalent than another, except for in my case, I think it would be more NASA, DARPA related.
Interesting. Now, I know that you were very young when you were brought into the program, sold into it by your father, which is a telltale sign of legitimacy, because they aren't just abducting people out of their beds at night, right? Like some would have you believe, and just returning you later on, right? They're either voluntarily going or they're sold into the program by a family member. So was this program mostly full of children, Cathy? And if so, how young of children?
Yeah, it was real prevalent in my childhood because my area in Muskegon, Michigan had been targeted for MK Ultra. It was considered by the local newspapers and everything to be the pedophile capital of Michigan. And pedophilia was found in the Hitler-Himmler research that came over with Project Paperclip to be the ultimate trauma base for mind control. And because I was multi-generational incest based after 3 generations of that abuse base, the brain inherits, you know, genetically to be more compliant and easily led. And in the particular area where I was growing up, it was saturated with it. So to me, I didn't know that good people even existed in the world. I didn't know there was a place where people didn't hurt each other. My Catholic Church was heavily involved in it. The Jesuit end was just, you know, completely saturated too with MK Ultra. So we had a huge mess in that area, and it started, in my case, at infancy, and I'm sure it did with a lot of kids. I was being trafficked to my grandfather's Blue Masonic Lodge, the politicians there, at about 3. Could have been younger, you know, but that's what I remember is at that age. So that was just very much a part of my upbringing, and it seemed like everywhere I looked, there was nowhere to turn for help, because so much was heavily involved. And then George Romney went on to become the governor of Michigan. He was an absolute MK Ultra mind control master, not only of individuals, but of, you know, the nation. I mean, he was going for the whole global population ultimately, like what we see unfolding. So in Michigan, where he was governor too, you know, then it was real prevalent. So in that aspect of my early life, it was definitely going on. And then when my daughter was born in 1980, she was born into MK Ultra on a higher level. More harmonics were used, more technology was used from birth with her, and that was just so common around me that by the time Mark rescued me out of the Washington, D.C. swamp in 1988, I really didn't know good people existed in the world. And it took me some time to even be able to trust him. I thought he must be, you know, an alien or an angel or something, because I didn't know good people even existed. So that's how saturated my world was with it. So I don't think I have a good overall view of how prevalent it really was, because it was extreme for me.
This is really interesting, David, because reading through the declassified Sunstreak documents, it mentions that the Chinese were using children as psychic experiments, and SRI was trying to duplicate this. Now, I don't know if that means duplicating it in the form of using children or just trying to duplicate the activities. Now, I'm pretty sure it's the latter, because no proof exists that SRI was experimenting on children. But I made a mental note of that, and I found that very interesting as a possibility. Now, we're
Yeah, possibility, that's just pure speculation. So
right.
we shouldn't toss that out there at them and with their work. And to be very clear, what was happening is that the CIA, including Gottlieb, the CIA was hearing intelligence, human intelligence or signal intelligence, where they became aware that both the Soviet Union and the Chinese are these two major communist entities, which were, let's face it and be honest with it, they were the enemies of our nation, and we were their enemy. Without any question, we were their enemy. This is long before China became a communist, capitalist society. So these were our enemies. And when we found out that they were doing that, this was not some evil or nefarious effort. These individuals were trying to find out, the question was asked, do we have a program like that? Are we doing that? And the answer was no, we are not. And so from that, that's when the sole source contract for SRI was let. Now, SRI, I'm sure had to develop a proposal, and I'm sure that the request for proposals went out to any of the existing research labs that were out there. As I recall, at the time, PAIR, SAIC, SRI International, and maybe a few others were all there. And they all got this request for proposals, and the proposal written to do the research that came back from SRI was the one selected. And so from that point, the determination was made that SRI International could do this research to a level that the others were incapable of reaching. Therefore, it was a sole source contract. So as a government contractor, as I am now, I understand the significance of a sole source contract. It pisses everybody else off, but when you get a sole source contract, that's a really good thing. So they got that, and then they started their work. And I told you that, the three big deliverables were, there were many other deliverables, but the three key deliverables, distilling the entire contract down for you, were simply this: can you prove scientifically, unequivocally, beyond any doubt, that there is an ability within human beings to see distant in space-time? In other words, ESP. Does it exist? Yes or no? And prove it scientifically without question. And we're going to get auditors to evaluate your findings. So just understand that up front. And that was their first deliverable. The second was, can you tell us who will be good at this, so that we can harvest them from the population and train them to be able to do this, or utilize them like the Soviets and the Chinese are going out and finding, it was alleged, the youth of their society that had a purported capability, that they were clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient, right? And they were trying to, the rumor was they were going to collect them all up, and they were going to study them and perfect them and fine tune them so that they could utilize them as an intelligence collection methodology against their enemies in the West, NATO. And so then the next thing, we're now involved in this process. So the thing that came back from SRI International on deliverable one was, yes, it's absolutely, unequivocally, undeniably, scientifically proven that this ability exists within humankind. Oh, awesome. Deliverable number two, who's good? What do we have to look for? What they, do they have red hair, blonde hair? Are they black? Are they brown? Are they white? Just tell us. Got to be a certain height, certain weight, male, female, tell us. And they went, actually, our research indicates that everybody has this ability. You're born with it. So therefore, I'm sure the CIA was thinking, oh shit. So now we can't go find people and harvest them, right? And herd them all in and, sequester them and use them. Now it's anybody, everybody's got it. In fact, you're born with it, which leads me to my next statement regarding that. Why were we endowed with those kinds of gifts if we were not intended to use them in some way throughout our life on this planet as human beings. And why did we surrender or allowed to surrender or taken from us this idea of omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and eternal, the nature of humankind, and it was stolen from us. In fact, in ancient Latin, those words exist to describe the properties of humankind, okay? And that was ripped away and applied to religion. And we were told, you don't have any of those things, but this invisible thing out here does. And as long as you live your life, pay your tithing, and believe what we believe, then you might get to meet this thing out here that is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and is eternal, but not you, you little, whatever you are, human. Just, okay. So that part answered a big question for me based on my upbringing in the LDS church and being a high priest in the LDS church. Next thing was, can you develop a training program? Can you replicate this? And I already answered that for you. They just couldn't do it. They couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag on that, because it's just not something they know how to do. It's not an easy thing to develop a military training program. I mean, those of us that did that in the military, we were trained to do it, and we were, and even being trained to do it did not necessarily mean you were going to be good at doing it. It was a huge undertaking. And man, I'm not surprised they couldn't do it. The thing that cracks me up is that they, to this very day, will not admit failure in the doing of that, but they miserably failed, which is why the Army just went, okay, yep, stay there. We're going to go do our own thing. And then so did the other services, Air Force and the Navy. So yeah, but training or looking at kids at SRI, hell no. I mean, that was so far. First of all, you'd already had MK Ultra burned down to its boot tops. So, they were running scared about that. And the fact that it was getting more and more exposed, and there were hearings and complaints and carrying on. And they were really trying to figure out, how the hell do we keep ourselves, stay under the radar at this particular point? How do we stay under the radar? So the idea that they would have at that point taken, fed SRI the mission as a deliverable to look at children. Now, let me, with caveat, say this. I don't know when they were organizing and rounding up all of their test subjects. Like, I guess if you go get, for Pete's sake, Tony Robbins said, and you all know who Tony Robbins said to like 3,000 people up on stage one time that he was one of the test subjects for the remote viewing program. How do I don't know that he was or he wasn't. So I'm just going to say that he said that. So was Ingo Swann. Ingo Swann was brought in as a test subject. So was Uri Geller. So was Pat Price. So was, any one of probably 100 other people were brought in. That's what allowed them to, start throwing people out and going, everybody has the ability, but only some people are willing to listen and or try or believe in the ability that they might have. And if you don't believe in the ability and you're not willing to experiment with yourself to do it, then you're wasting our time. Goodbye. But I can't say with any certainty that they didn't, have an age limit and go below that age limit, or if that age limit was not dropped down to 5 years old. I have no idea. But if it was, remember, the objective was not to torture the 5 years olds. It was to try to determine whether or not they had a clairvoyant bone in their body that they could then, figure out how to use, because that's what they heard that the enemies of the nation were actively pursuing. Now, in truth, I don't know if that's what the Russians were doing, the Soviets or the Chinese were doing. I sure as heck wouldn't put it past them. And in those countries, as you know, particularly at that time in the midst of the Cold War, if, tying children or anything else upside down in a barn, if they thought that, would get better intel result, that's what they'd be doing, is tying people upside down like chickens, right? And that because they just didn't care. You're talking about societies that had let millions, tens of millions of their own people die and perish from starvation and other things. They couldn't care less. Stalin didn't care, nor did Mao. So that's what we were looking at in those days. And trust me, the CIA and everyone around that whole part of they were frightened to death about that. They were very frightened about that. So made a lot of wrong choices, absolutely. Evil, I guess you could apply that to that, but I won't. I just think that they were scared to death, and they were willing to do anything to meet their objective, which was to, defend, the interests of this republic at all costs. Unfortunately, at all costs translates to a lot of human suffering and misery and other things. But they thought that they had wrongly, they thought absolutely wrongly, atrociously had lowered the bar, thinking that they had selected the underbelly of people that they could use in those ways and abuse them. That was their plan, and it was horribly wrong as a human use program. And maybe they weren't as punished as widely or badly as they probably should have been. But I also, having come from that world and having been a guy that's done a lot of very strange things in my lifetime in the military and etc., I understand what was motivating them, and I don't see them, at least in what I know of them, as being like cruel and sadistic individuals. I see them as being individuals who had this idea that what they were doing was to protect the republic, and they were willing to sacrifice other human beings to do that. That was where the line was crossed that shouldn't have been crossed. That's how I saw it anyway.
Walter, through your research and investigation, do we know of any governmental programs that were using children for experimental purposes, whether that be for MK Ultra experiments, psychic experiments? Because we know there was at least 4 MK Ultra sub-projects out of the 149 declassified documents that were directly related to the psychic and ESP phenomenon.
Well, I think in the known documented history of MK Ultra, whatever they did to look at children or youth for, as David puts it, the recruitment in developing abilities, I think to some extent that's there, but I came away with my perspective on this, not so much what I learned in an official capacity or in my research, but in my interactions with my mentor. Now, he got me started, he had me go apply to Uncle Sam. I was 23 years old. And he had told me that he had been watching me since childhood. And he had determined that between me and my sisters, I was the one that would have been the most enthused and open to it. As David explained, you look for the ones willing to do it, right? And then as he would teach me things, again, off base, not an official installation, he would tell me there are people expected, depending upon you knowing how to do this, there are people expecting you to know how to do this. And I would say, who are they? And he would say, you don't need to know that yet, that kind of thing. Now, remember, you've heard me talk about this. Yes, one of the things I was instructed to do, how to do in detail and expected to know how to do, was necromancy. I mean, I was taught necromancy. I was taught how to go to a cemetery, pick a subject, and how to go through a process to allegedly, because I never quite did it completely, but allegedly make contact with a dead spirit. I was given specifics on gender, on how long they were supposed to have been dead, on the seasons of the year that I was supposed to do this. And this was while I was an employee in counterintelligence for the FBI at the same time. Nothing in my FBI duties instructed me to do this. This was my mentor instructing me to do this on the side. And yeah, there's a colonial era cemetery on Long Island that's where I chose my first subject to do this. And again, I was told there are people expecting you to know how to do this. So all that to say, I think what, like the things Cathy's talking about, and from my experience, from my perspective, it looks to me, and within the history of MK Ultra, the known history of MK Ultra and related things, and I allude to the fact that the Air Force was so turned on by this in the 50s. I think what has happened here is that other organizations, be it military or intelligence, civilian organizations, I think other organizations got their hands on these technologies, be it, MK Ultra, be it remote viewing, be it whatever, and they have used it for their own purposes. And I would say that's probably where the more nefarious things, because I agree with David's assessment from his perspective. He's absolutely right. Even the guys who started MK Ultra, in the Air Force in the early days, whatever, they're doing this from a positive perspective. That stuff I wrote about my dad, I'm convinced MK Ultra was applied to him to suppress talking about an actual classified project. I'm convinced that false narrative was laid over. Remember, I also think that my dad and the other guys that would have been exposed to this were aware that it was going to be done and would have volunteered. Yeah, count me in, because they were patriots. They were young guys in the Air Force. They were protecting a program they were working on. They were, I would guess that they would have been told, hey, when we're done, we're going to use this new technique. It uses hypnosis, and you're not going to remember working on the project. I could see my dad and the guys he worked with saying, count me in, because again, they wanted to do their duty. And they went, I would say that the Air Force basically went into this with the best of intentions for national defense purposes. Where you get into the bad stuff is, again, like what David said and what Cathy's alluded to. You, unfortunately, when you're in intelligence, particularly human, you've heard this before, you have to do business with some pretty sleazy people from time to time. And I think what has happened is the sleazy people, as they were involved and learned about some of these more incredible things, applied these things and began to use these things for nefarious reasons outside the intended scope of their development. I think that's where the bad stuff that Cathy talks about comes from, is bad elements. And God knows we know, right? We know today we talk about it in terms of deep state. It's unfortunately, I think what it was is a Pandora's box, right? A genie that was let out of the bottle, and we didn't control who got their hands on it.
Yeah, it's called mission creep.
Yeah.
You're familiar with the term. It's called mission creep. And then with compartmentalization, wherein with compartmentalization, whoever is the head of these particular programs, each one of those sub projects ends up being in its own compartmentalized perspective. Mm-hmm. And in compartmentalization, and I learned this when I became a strategic deceiver, right? Mm-hmm. Where I worked in an office that had some 35 people. All of us were great skillers, which was a very odd thing. It was like the third circle of hell for me to go there and to do that as what was called intel words, great skills. And these are guys that dropped off. They were no longer in the Army per se. They were actually carrying around civilian ID cards. Mm-hmm. And they were paid. We were all paid through an organization called Allied Communications. So I didn't even get a government paycheck through like a normal LES, leave and earnings statement, right? Didn't get one anymore. So that was a very weird thing to be there. And out of 35 people there, let's say somewhere around 20 were running strategic deception operations. And of those 20 people, no one was allowed to tell anybody else what it is that you were working on. Because if you were doing that, then that could potentially pose a leak, and that defies the rules of compartmentalization. Right. But here's the point I wanted to make with this, is that even the lieutenant colonel and the colonel who were in charge of that entire organization, they were only told what each project was doing based on whatever that project officer was willing to expose. And they would never pry deeper or ask other questions. They would only ask enough information for them to be able to answer somebody above them a question, answer the question that somebody above them might ask. But that's how a compartmental filter works, is that you never, ever violate that compartmentalization theory or rule, and you don't tell your boss more than your boss needs to know. And you're in charge of what you tell your boss. And your boss then is in charge of protecting you and the program, and only tells their boss what they think that person needs to know.
Yeah.
And if that other boss comes back and says, oh no, I know there's something else going on there, I want you to tell me everything. Oh yes, sir, I'll do that right away. And my boss would come back and go, they want to know everything. I understood the rules when I got read on the program. I understand the wink, wink. Okay, so you go back and take exactly the same briefing, change it around a little bit, put some BS in there, throw some numbers in there that aren't real, that don't mean anything, and push it right back to your boss, and they'll go, thank you, and go back and throw it to the other guy. And because the other boss has absolutely no idea, it's all just rumor, the other boss eventually has to accept it. That's why people that think that, you're going to squeeze the government for UFO information, you're not going to squeeze the government for UFO information. That is TS, that's a TS SAP special, and that is never going to be divulged. And all they're going to do is turn around and give you lip service. And it's like every president that I've known in the last 68 years has at some point in time turned around and told the voters that I'm going to get to the bottom of this, right?
Yep.
And that people don't understand that the people that are in charge of those special access programs, especially these are not military officers that are in charge of those special access programs. These are Department of Defense civilians or otherwise, and they have been there. Have been in charge of that SAP for 30 years, and they picked their own successor, and their predecessor picked them. And so they are all trained exactly how they're going to do that. And they consider that guy sitting in the White House to be a transient occupier of that White House. And that there is no legal precedent wherein a president can turn around and demand that the intelligence community or elements thereof tell them everything. They can do that. But have you ever heard of anybody in the CIA or any special access program ever being prosecuted for failing to divulge everything that some congressman, senator, president, etc. might have asked for? No, you have not. And you never will, because Department of Justice has no authority to do that. And what is given to those intelligence organizations that do that, the CIA, for example, is they will only report back exactly what they want them to be able to hear. They will look at what they did just on the enhanced interrogations techniques, the report. They ended up whittling a report that basically told all, and whittled it down into 400 pages, which essentially they were in control of the narrative and the information, despite the fact that Feinstein was behind it, right? And trying to make it be what it was supposed to be. And who was running interference for the agency? The White House. So that's how this works, because the White House realizes this is a windmill we're not going to charge, because we're going to look really stupid when we break our lance on it, right? And they just tell us nothing. So that's how that works. And that's why I get to the point of, how much of your life do you want to spend thinking that you're going to twist the arm of the government to tell you something that they're never going to tell you? I mean, I don't get it. It's like there are some things that we can affect, and there are things that we cannot affect, and stuff like that, we are not going to affect it. And if there really was if aliens really wanted to interface with us, they'd
Right.
freaking land on the White House lawn and go up and knock on the door, you know? But I mean, it's not like people aren't trying, right? I mean, if they really wanted to just drop down and come over and shake hands with a 3-fingered hand or something, I mean, why do you want to spend the rest of your life thinking you're going to twist the government's arm to do something for you? Because I'm telling you, trust me on this, they are not. And all that, what the hoopla that's going on right now based on, released cockpit camera footage and stuff like that, it's like, it's very entertaining. And all the promises, all these guys posturing, about what's going to happen. Watch.
Yeah. Well, UFO candidates, here's an interesting that happens every time. UFO candidates, when they do become president, they are told something about that topic that convinces them to shut up about it. And I think what they're told is that has to do with national defense technology. But something they're told convinces them, okay, I'm going to shut up about this. And that's why they don't deliver on those promises, like you said, because they're told something, whatever it is, that shuts that down.
I think what they're told is, you can ask, but we're not sharing it.
That could be it too.
That's what I think happens. People don't want to believe it, but I'm having seen those curmudgeons that run those special access programs. I mean, these guys have dirt behind, dust behind their ears. They just don't care. They don't care who asks them anything. They will tell you only what they decide they're going to tell you and nothing else. And so, military officers, elected officials, heck, even people in the intel community that may be oversight to them, just go like, okay, it's not going to happen. And the other thing is, let's assume that there may be, craft that have been either captured, shot down, crashed with bodies and other kinds of things. If you understand the global defense network, if we had that, do you really think that whoever might be tearing that apart, reverse engineering it, trying to build this or build that, what do you think we would be doing with it? We would be trying to figure out if we could weaponize it. We'd be trying to figure out if we could use it to theoretically to protect the Republic, or maybe pursue world domination. I don't know, but what they don't want to do is, and they never would do, is if we own that, they're not going to share it with the Chinese and the Russians. They're not going to do that, and neither would they if they had it. I mean, for Pete's sake, up until the mid 50s, we wouldn't even tell the UK about how to build an atomic weapon. So Orford Nest was born. It was almost 1960 before we even said, all right, we'll tell you all about it, right?
Because we had something more powerful than that. It's like, okay, now we'll let you do this because we have that.
All of this is pretty simple when you look at it. And it's not, at least in my opinion, for me, it is not stuff I am going to worry about or spend not 2 brain cells on trying, thinking that I'm going to be able to affect some of that. It just isn't worth it to me. And I see it all the time happening. And I just think, why are you doing that? I mean, move on and, put all that energy that you're trying to do for that and move it forward into something positive, make a difference in the human condition, make a difference in your life and a difference in the human condition, affect the global society by doing something positive to steer it that way and stop, just fighting backwards. I mean, I could fight backwards on a lot of things that have happened in my life, being molested when I was by a freaking retired circus clown sexually when I was 8 and 9 years old, being called retarded by a teacher because I was grossly dyslexic when I was in 2nd grade, and so forth and so on, right? But I don't live my life looking back, and I just don't. I'm trying to, and I have always, tried to live more powerfully day to day. And so I understand what goes on in this world we're talking about. And I'm okay with that because I understand it, that there's nothing comes out of it anyway. Nothing that we're going to affect, and nothing that's going to affect, the human condition of the global society.
You never know, David. We can make a huge difference here.
Oh, sure you can.
Never know, my friend.
Sure.
But
Just more
I think we
information.
could.
More information changes everything, right? So, I mean, I get it. I understand what you're thinking, but this cowboy is, I don't necessarily share. This is not my first rodeo. I'm like at least three times your age almost. So I've seen it and heard it all for a long time. And
you haven't had anyone
talking.
you haven't had anyone email you, David, and say that you have changed their life, that you've made a difference in their life personally?
Yeah, but by teaching them remote viewing, by teaching them remote viewing, or just telling my story as I tell it, that might be there. But I'm telling my story as I tell it is the way I'm kind of sharing it with you here. It's not me going back and finding reasons to be offended because of certain elements in my life. It's trying to say to people, that happened, but it means nothing to me. All I can do is take from it what made me stronger in this life, how I live moment to moment now, because right now is all I'm in charge of. I'm not in charge of 50 years ago. And I'm not in charge of 5 days for 5 minutes from now. I'm only in charge of right now. And that's the thing I think that I teach or talk about to people. And I think that's the thing that moves people forward in a positive way for them. But I know you don't have me here to preach about stuff like that. And I don't mean to. I'm just,
no, I think it's just interesting because I think that, I mean, I've had people email me and message me and be like, hey, like your show has done a lot for me. And that's not me, bragging or anything. I'm just saying that I think that if we just affect one individual, if just one individual gets something out of this roundtable conversation that we've had here this evening, then we've done a good job and we've done good work, right?
This show draws a particular kind of an audience to it, and they are hungry for the kinds of things that are being talked about here. So yes, that in that respect, I'm sure that it is empowering for people to hear it. And I'm not discounting that at all. I'm just giving you my perspective over the things we've been talking about. And it's just my perspective. It doesn't mean that I'm 100% right. It just is my opinion. And it's how I choose to process that and live with that. There are certain things that I might charge, as a Don Quixote, and there are other things I just will not do it because I know that it's not a windmill that I'm going to ever knock over. So
I think what David's also saying is part of his point, correct me if I'm wrong, David, is that, yeah, we can influence people's lives and stuff, but nothing we say here is going to bring about disclosure, ET disclosure.
Correct.
I think that's the point. There's just certain things that we can gather, we can talk, we can put our heads together, but there's just certain things we are not going to change by doing that.
Oh no, and I agree with that absolutely, but that shouldn't prevent us from talking about it and having a conversation about it.
Not at all. I'm always happy to talk about it. I just always want to tell that story because look at the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of people who think that it's all going to change. And just look at the stuff that comes out of it. I mean, some of the just fabrications and from people, and they start reaching and reaching and reaching. And, in all of this, in all of these things that we are talking about, discernment is really a key quality that all of us as lecturers and writers and, presenters, we have to be capable of telling people to be discerning nowadays. Otherwise, all we're doing is throwing gasoline on them and setting them on fire and watching them run, which is what they do. And there are people that are literally spending their entire lives, like every waking moment of their lives, spun up into this kind of stuff and being pissed off and angry with anything and everyone because it's not shaking out the way they think it should shake out. And we have a powerful voice, all of us here, to turn around and say, none of us here doubt these things. I don't doubt anything that our government has done. I don't doubt it. Do I understand what motivated it? Pretty much I do, except as we jumped off on this with Walter, is that we also realize there are bad actors, and bad actors have a tendency to migrate in a lot of ways to these secret compartmented, special access programs. And then mission creep allows them to do things that are really unethical, highly questionable, in fact, criminal. And I don't doubt that at all. I do not doubt that that has happened. And it's scarring, I know, to people that have endured that. But I also know that we can, with a united, powerful voice, that we can cause people to rise up away from those kinds of things and move forward more powerfully and truly try to do something to bring us out of this fourth turning, this destructive phase of the global society that we are in right now. We've been in a destructive phase now for almost 40 years. And, we're past what Strauss and Howe said was the normal length of a turning, right? We're supposed to be in a rebuilding phase.
Mm-hmm.
We just ended 20 years of war, and but the global society is back at another war again, and so now we find ourselves there. And so I'm hoping that all our messages are messages of promise and possibility, and trying to seek the positive. And it's okay to be purveyors of the truth, but the purveyors of the truth, which we are, needs to be coupled with, in my opinion, not for everybody, but in my opinion, it needs to be coupled with an understanding that things that have happened are things that have happened. And our objective is to live our life and empower individuals to try to not let that ever happen again. And that means teaching people to be discerning, teaching people to live powerfully, teaching people, to own their own life and own their life in the moment. And as best you can. Doesn't mean you won't get swept up into evil again, but you're less likely to get swept up in evil if you are aware of the kinds of things that we're talking about and your power, right, of yourself in the moment, your own intention, moment to moment. That's just how I try to live my life with it these days.
So trying to connect some dots here and connect this MK Ultra to psychic abilities, ESP abilities. Cathy, did you or anyone that or like I said, yourself, have any kind of new abilities after this process through the MK Ultra program, whether that be clairvoyance, clairaudience, astral abilities, telekinesis, anything along those lines?
Well, I think it's been interesting listening to how the government agencies were attempting to study things, and they're looking like the whole wrong direction. In my case, because my brain was compartmentalized, not just an agency, my brain was compartmentalized, where the neuron pathways of the brain actually shut down from various traumas. So there's no intercommunication between the various compartments set up in the brain, which was like the part of my brain that dealt with my father's sexual abuse, the part of my brain that was trafficked, the part of my brain that was used in child pornography, all these different compartments of the brain. There's no intercommunication in between. And within those compartments, the way our brain responds to traumas, there's a photographic memory within those compartments. And the government thought, what better place to hide their secrets than in the mind of someone who can't think to bring it to mind. This part of my brain didn't know what this part had done, and therefore I had heightened endurance because I didn't know, it didn't signal my body to be tired. There's all kinds of things that happen with the compartmentalization in the brain, including a shutting down of an ability to think free, because there is no firing happening. There's no capacity for any free thought, no conscious free thought at all. The subconscious is wide open to being easily led and manipulated, and the subconscious is like highly suggestible. So with that said, that was I had no free thought of my own, no capacity to think for myself until after I healed. The first 30 years of my life were spent in doing what others told me to do and carrying out their bidding, no matter what it was. And I couldn't think to say no, and I couldn't think to not do it. Because I had no capacity for thinking, my brain was like blasted into other parts where I had a heightened senses, a real strong sense of energy and heightened intuition. And it went into an ability to understand telepathy, complete telepathic communication, and a whole level of thinking and operating that is something that I don't think can be studied because it goes into such a deeper level. It's not something you can hook a brain up to and see happening. And I think it's like a almost a spiritual defense mechanism. And it's one that I've retained because after I healed and when I did regain my capacity to think for myself and have conscious awareness and open those neuron pathways in my brain, I didn't lose those abilities. I have extreme heightened intuition, and it goes into even the point of dreams, because under mind control, because of the sleep deprivation and the way that my brain was compartmentalized, I had no capacity to dream. I didn't dream for the first 30 years of my life. And when I was regaining my free thought and starting to dream, I would have night terrors. And I didn't want to have night terrors. So I took control of that the same way that I did heal my brain. And that was by picking up a pen and writing it out, because it shifts information to the logic, critical analysis part of the brain, and where it can be consciously dealt with. So I kept a notebook beside my bed, and I would make a note of night terrors. And then that way I was able to stop the night terrors and take control of that aspect of my dreams. Well, from that point, since all this has been disrupted in my brain already, the normal patterns, I've already been disrupted. As I reclaimed control over it, I found that my dreams are extremely intuitive. They do foresee into the future. I have extreme insights and realizations that are really profound to my life. And it's something that I cherish. It is allows for synchronicities and insights and capacities that to detail them out and tell you exactly how amazing they are, would take a whole nother show in itself. But there is that capacity there. That is a byproduct of my torturous MK Ultra mind control experience of the structured compartmentalization of my brain, and then, like I said, like blasting me into primitive parts of my brain. Because back when we did telepathically communicate, we did have a heightened sense of each other, a heightened compassion. We knew we could sense danger, we could sense good, we could sense those things, so animals can do that. You look at dogs, they know who's danger, who's a threat, and who's good and who's bad, and that's just on an animalistic level of that. But the human capacity embraces all of that. So, hearing these the government studies and the way they were looking into studying it was like, well, they should have followed through with the MK Ultra slaves that they had created and found out what the after byproduct was, because I'm certainly not the only one. It's a very common after effect of that kind of traumatic experience.
Yes, I am in full agreement with that I think that some of these abilities are a byproduct of MK Ultra. Now, Dave, in this SRI document I read, it literally says in this document, as observed in the laboratory, the basic remote viewing phenomenon appears to cover a wide range of subjective experiences, right? Referred to in medical literature as disassociation, which I find very interesting, and I'm going to come back to that, right? But psychological literature is clairvoyance, traveling clairvoyantly, or out-of-body experiences. Parapsychologically is astral projection, and SRI chose the term remote viewing as, I think it stated, it's a natural descriptive term free from occult assumptions and biases, which I think is very interesting because there's a lot of mention of the Monroe Institute in the Girl Flame documents, which was to induce an out-of-body experience. And Army intelligence paid Monroe Institute $2,000 to study with Robert Monroe. But there's a lot to unpack here. But first, I want to focus on the disassociative aspect here, because dissociative identity disorder was a known byproduct cause of MK Ultra in the MK Ultra experimentation.
Okay, but MK Ultra is not SRI International, and so I never read, and I read the entire historical file from the remote viewing program and SRI, CIA, and what they were suspecting the Soviets and the Chinese were doing, and others, like the other countries that were studying various aspects of the paranormal. I never saw anything referencing disassociative tendencies in any of the things that were going on there. You mentioned the Monroe Institute, and I think I've told you this story before, that the Monroe Institute was a curiosity, and it was a curiosity for a number of reasons. First of all, Joe McMoneagle and Skip Atwater were two guys that went over to the Monroe Institute, probably part of that $2,000 fee that was paid to the Monroe Institute, because it was General Bert Stubblebine and his deputy, and Bert Stubblebine was supported by Major General Thompson, or Lieutenant General Thompson and Major General Stubblebine. So 2-star, 1 and 3-star. And they were looking at everything. And why were they doing it? It was the 1970s. I mean, we had come out of Vietnam where we got, kicked in the groin, and we had a bad experience there. We now had an all voluntary military, no longer a draft. It was the first time when performance-oriented training was introduced in the military. It was the first time when organizational effectiveness was introduced into the military, and people were trained to do these sensing sessions to sort stuff out. It was the first time when remote viewing was being studied at SRI International. And it didn't call it remote viewing. The term of remote viewing did not originate from SRI. Remote viewing, that term came from Ingo Swann. That was his term. SRI called it remote sensory perceptions, or remote communications channels. They called it all kinds of things, but they didn't call it remote viewing. That document may indicate that, but that document would have indicated that after the term remote viewing was adopted by the U.S. military, based on what Ingo Swann had thrown it together. He coined that term. It came from him. But
in turn, wouldn't that come from SRI though?
Nope.
Because he was an SRI test subject.
He was an SRI test subject, but he wasn't like a full-time employee of SRI. And no, when he finally was the guy that went and taught the military, he wasn't working for SRI. In fact, I don't know that he ever even got paid by SRI, other than maybe they paid him for his time to be there as a test subject, or maybe he got paid to go back there to help them do some of the things that they were trying to do. He was the one that was trying to get them to define a particular protocol, according to him, which Targ mostly, according to Ingo, was completely off put by that whole thing, because their big test subject that they liked the most was Pat Price. And you've seen the videos, the Nova video and the other things. Pat Price would sit in a chair, and then there would be an interviewer that would steer Pat Price around. And this was one of the things that caused PAIR and SAIC and, in their analysis of what he was doing to come back and say, well, you're just leading. You're leading him. You're asking him leading questions. You're doing this and doing that. This is why the military unit very quickly got to the point where that monitor or use of a monitor was just completely nixed. And they did it during training because the monitor could help the new remote viewing student kind of remember what they were supposed to do. Why? Because they didn't give them reference sheets. They didn't even have a program of instruction or a training outline. There was no manual for that. So a monitor was there to help prompt you along in the protocols of what you were trying to learn and perform, because it was a lot of moving pieces, quite frankly. But once you became operational, it was considered a really taboo thing for you to rely upon a monitor at that point. Operational meaning you had graduated in coordinate remote viewing training, and they now deemed you're an operational viewer. We're going to use you on actual intel targets. We're also going to continue to give you training and calibration targets, but we're going to use you on real spy stuff now. Okay. So once that happened, for somebody to go, can I get a monitor? People would have just looked down their nose at you like, oh, really? You need training wheels again, kind of a thing. But that is all SRI did. That's all they did. And so when Ingo broke off of that and the government brought Ingo in and by government, I mean the military, Department of Defense, and brought him in to develop these protocols and teach them, that was a big break from SRI. I'm sure there was some animosity there, but that was a big break from SRI. And the Monroe Institute, Joe McMoneagle was there because Stubblebine was paying for that. And Joe McMoneagle fell in love with Robert Monroe's daughter. He was single, fell in love with Robert Monroe's daughter. So now Joe McMoneagle retires and goes to the Monroe Institute. And, Robert Monroe is aging and, wants to take a back seat. And here's this big guy that comes in, sort of takes over the program. He brings his buddy, Skip Atwater, who comes out of the unit when he retires. Now you got Joe McMoneagle and Skip Atwater there. Now, not taking anything away from these guys, but of course they were trying to get the government to pay for Monroe Institute more. That would have been a big, coup to be able to get the government to turn around and start sending people to the Monroe Institute on a routine basis, give them a contract. But that didn't happen. And it didn't happen for a number of reasons. The first thing that General Stubblebine did was he asked the current director, meaning program manager at at Det Ops, which was what Sunstreak was called, and, Grill Flame, to ask them for an assessment of the value of sending people to Monroe Institute. Well, the person that actually wrote that was Skip Atwater. So Skip Atwater writes this back. Skip Atwater was gone. So it was another guy that wrote it. I think his successor. And what he wrote was very neutral because he didn't want to upset people. So he wrote this kind of neutral thing and then went into this long diatribe of just, kind of quantum mind stuff based on things he was snagging out of books and drawings that he copied over and things. So Stubblebine just went, yeah, that's not what I want. And then the CIA stepped in and went, to answer this question, no. You're not going to send them to the Monroe Institute. We're done with this now. It is interesting. And, maybe there are some guys there who've got a security clearance, but that organization doesn't have a security clearance. And so we're going to answer the question for you. No, you're not. We're not sending people to the Monroe Institute anymore. So stop it. Particularly remote viewers, we're not sending. You want to go grab some E4s out of your staff, General Stubblebine, and send them there as long as you fund it. So what do you think happened? It It was done. No more Monroe Institute. You asked me some other questions. You threw a bunch out there for me to unpack. I think I hit like 3 of them so far.
Well, if Ego Swan was working directly for the government to train these Army intelligence and DIA personnel, why is he not mentioned in any of the declassified documents? He's not mentioned in the Grow Flame document. He's not mentioned in the Sunstreak document. And if he's working directly for them and he's not being contracted by SRI, because we know Army intelligence and DIA was contracting SRI during the entire run of the program.
No, actually, that's not true. But let me address your first statement there. You're assuming that everything that the CIA released over the years is the total picture. You're seeing precisely what they want you to see and nothing more. And it goes right back to this whole thing again, is the CIA is not the Central Information Agency. It's the Central Intelligence Agency. They don't give a crap what you think or anything else. And anything that they looked at, there would have been, right now there's something like 27,000 pages of information are out there, or is it 17,000 documents? And it doesn't matter. Let's round up. It's 100,000 pages. If you counted the amount of the volume of classified data that would have come out of that organization after 20 some odd years of existence, you're looking at a fractional amount, like maybe 10%. And that's giving you a very generous piece of that. The only thing they released were the things that they didn't care about you knowing.
Well, I mean, that's obvious. That's obvious that we don't have all of the information, but I'm only working off. I'm only working off based of what I have, though, Dave. I can only go off of what I've seen and what I've read. That's why I'm answering
the question for you. You can't say, well, why do we not know about Ingo Swann? You don't know about Ingo Swann because Ingo Swann probably didn't want you to know, and they didn't want you to know about Ingo Swann. It's not like the guy was not a controversial guy, you know. A sadomasochistic gay man living in the Bowery of New York that, was painting sadomasochistic gay paintings and was a known frequenter of a number of places there. I mean, I know that. So they probably didn't want, particularly at that time, they didn't want to have that themselves looped into that. I mean, I'm sorry, but I mean, they think like that. They always are expert at keeping somebody between them and the problem, always. And they look at everything very carefully and in very calculated terms. And they did not just release everything. I mean, the stuff that's out there is nothing. I've looked at it. And I mean, yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that you have and that you call upon and utilize. But you have to keep remembering that you have exactly what they wanted you to get and nothing more. So I don't know why they didn't put Ingo Swann, or you didn't get a document that listed Ingo Swann as a trainer. I didn't see any documents that were released under that. Remember also that the documents they released primarily talked about the Army program, the DIA DT-S program, not the Navy or the Air Force program. I didn't see any documents that talked about this. There are lots of guys that stand up now and say they were part of that program. And I never saw any evidence of that ever. Even in the unit, nobody ever talked about that. So it could have been compartmental and nobody actually knew if there was a Navy program or an Air Force program. The only reason I suspect that there was is because when I got out of the Army and I worked in New York, I saw Ingo Swann weekly at his brownstone in the Bowery. And he told me that he had trained other groups of people, but would never tell me what that other group of people were. But he said there were like 3 or 4 different groups. So I suspect, okay, Air Force, maybe Navy, when people say that, okay, I can buy that. But I'm sure he probably trained some CIA organizations, as well. So the CIA had its own little party ongoing with that. But yeah, I don't know why he's not in any of the documents, but there has to be a reason for it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Walter, do you think that there's any kind of connection here between out of body experiences, astral travel, NDEs, near death experiences, dissociative identity disorder, and MK Ultra.
Well, first I want to say I now can't get the picture out of my head of Ingo Swann in, leather chaps, a Nazi hat, carrying a riding crop.
Not a Nazi hat, but definitely the black leather hat.
Oh,
He's very much
get
into
out
that.
of my head.
And that's not a secret. I mean, it's not.
Oh,
a
no,
secret.
no. I've heard allusions to that before.
Yeah.
You reframe your question. Do I see a connection between those things and MK Ultra? Is what you're asking?
Yes, just the
Okay.
yeah.
Here's how I look at this. I think that now when you're jumping over to MK Ultra, you are, as David said, you're talking about CIA and nefarious thing. We're talking about that mission creep, nefarious part of MK Ultra that the CIA did. I think those phenomena have a basis in reality, but I think these kinds of things were used by the more nefarious elements within MK Ultra, also to control people as handling implements as control. So, even if something can be real, it can also be used as a false narrative. Now, the mention of Sidney Gottlieb came up earlier. Well, we know that he was kind of the wizard scholar, right? Of really what a lot of us in the community would consider cool things, like the paranormal and related subjects. So we know that there's a guy that would have applied knowledge of these things. So to answer the question, even though I think those things are real, yeah, I do think certain elements of MK Ultra program and in certain elements using MK Ultra technology, because again, I think we're talking about a genie that was let out of a bottle, a Pandora's box. Okay, just because you might be able to argue that the CIA is no longer doing MK Ultra, somebody is, and so I think it's both. I think these things do have a basis in reality, but I do think that these are the kinds of things that were used and abused by MK Ultra. But there's another rumored organization out there that is alleged to have been really turned on by these types of things that could be the ones involved with wielding some of this stuff on behalf of Uncle Sam or Uncle Sam's related interests. And that's this misty, murky, called the Collins elite, but I don't think they call themselves that. Those guys, it might be some of those guys that have, taken stuff from MK Ultra, probably taken stuff from RV, and would be applying it for their own purposes. So there to me might be the intersection between those phenomena you're talking about and a connection to some type of MK Ultra technique in bringing this out and enhancing the ability to do things like the necromancy that I was taught, and told that there were people expecting me to know how to do this and such. So I hope that answered the question. I think it's yes and both, whatever.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
You said you were taught necromancy.
Yes.
Were you actually taught, or were you just
for it? I was instructed the specifics, how to do it. And I wanted to add on there, it has more than once crossed my mind that this in itself could have been a handling tactic used on me. How a mentor might have wanted to keep some type of handling control over me, so was feeding this stuff to me, convincing me that, hey, this is real. You got to know how to do this, as some type of means to keep me hooked, right? So even I question, because I'll tell you right now, even though I went out and applied the techniques, did I ever see a dead spirit rise before me and get no? I never successfully, in my opinion, ever raised a dead spirit. So, I was in the business for a while of handling sources and assets. So I learned a bit about the tactics that you use to push buttons in the human psyche to get them to do what you want to do. So I admit that all that spooky stuff could very well have been that.
Let's face it, it's probably a good thing you never conjured up a spirit,
right?
It's not a positive thing. But let's face it, if you're training a case officer, the entire mission of them, when handling assets, is to do what? To convince that person it's in their best interest to betray their country and provide our country with intelligence information.
Yeah.
By whatever means necessary. And so you're given a bevy of tools and you're taught how to use those tools. And manipulation of them can come in many different forms, many different forms. And good case officers can use them all, and they can size up people very quickly, and they can figure out, where the weaknesses in that person's profile and personality are. Immediately stick something in and start twisting.
It's scary knowledge. I remember the first time that I pushed an asset's certain buttons in there and the light went on in his eyes. And I came away from that going, whoa, I did that just through my talking to this guy and working him, not for nefarious things. I just, I needed his help, with something, and he was the guy who could do it. And the themes that I was pushing those buttons and working on them to get him to go, yeah, I'll help. I remember when the light went on with it, the theme that worked. And that I realized then, I'm like, whoa, this is a pretty awesome power to wield over another human being, and not something to just do indiscreetly.
It's definitely that business, though.
Cathy, do you think that the MK Ultra process has been expanded and has evolved into a technology, a device, if you will, that can potentially control the thoughts and the ideas of a person's belief system?
Oh, easy. For sure that. Mind control is a sliding scale anyway. MK Ultra mind control is a scientific formula. And the formula is the same whether it's applied to an individual or a nation, to a whole population. And, again, there's a sliding scale to information control. So that makes a big difference right there. And technologically, what they had back in the 80s and 90s, I can only imagine how far it's advanced to this point. But they have harmonic capacities for voice of God technologies back in the 70s. So when you consider that, you're tapping into somebody's belief system right there. And the belief systems are autogenic, they're passed down generational, and it's a part of our innate being that they're distorting and we're capable of then. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't have full capacity for anything like that at this point. And it was really interesting too, hearing about the spiritual aspect. And I have such a completely different point of view of the discussion that's going on, which is just absolutely fascinating to hear, when from my point of view, the experience, of being tortured to near-death experiences for absolute robotic mind control purposes, my spirit was always in a safe, loving space. And it was though there's an overview, that we hear about people who've been in an accident and they feel like they're looking down over the scene below or whatever. I definitely experienced that many, many times from that that space high above. And it's as though the spirit has always preserved us in a safe, loving space. There is this capacity there. And it's so nonlinear that I can't imagine trying to go into a graveyard and trying to conjure a ghost or connect with a ghost in that regard, because there's that would be like lizard aliens versus multidimensional aliens. It's just a little bit too linear. I think we've got a whole lot of aspects to consider and a wider range of thinking. What an amazing conversation this is today, and taking that and expanding and thinking further, because we have more capacity within us than people have tapped into, and all this government study hasn't even come close to getting to the source of it all, just based on my own life's experience. But my gosh, I sure don't know it all. What's beyond that? We have so much possibility, and it's a really exciting thing to think where we can go from here by getting together in conversation like this, and expanding knowledge and looking further and considering how the human mind can be manipulated based on innate fears and belief systems and whatever it is that we've been conditioned for, genetically or otherwise. We have so much more capacity than we're aware of, and MK Ultra tapped into so much of that to create 44 times visual acuity in soldiers, where you get the expanded vision, because it's like your eyes are open, wide open, with eyes in the back of the head, trying to see trauma before it comes again. There's so many defense mechanisms that we have within us that we need to realize MK Ultra has tapped into for negative purposes, but nevertheless are an ability that we have within ourselves. It's like military special forces being programmed with no time to bleed, where they can take a bullet and keep on going, because their body is able to regulate that through the mind control. If that happens through outside influence, imagine what we can do with the power of the mind from within ourselves. We have the ability to regulate our blood flow. We have the ability for 44 times visual acuity. We have the ability for expanded physical endurance. And those are things that I think maybe martial arts has gone into, or we go within ourselves and tap into that with our own strength of spirit. But what we're capable from within ourselves is far more than can be manipulated from the outside. So we've got a whole new world to be exploring, and it's absolutely amazing.
Dave, do you think being shot in the helmet during combat and having a quasi version of a near-death experience have anything to do with your ability to remote view and be put into this Army Intelligence and DIA remote viewing unit?
No, it was. I mean, look, we're all born with these abilities, and so it was not unique to me. It wasn't unique to any of the others within the organization. You didn't have to get shot in the helmet. You didn't have to have a heart attack. You didn't have to have any of those kinds of things to recognize. Oh, let me rephrase. You didn't have to have any of those kinds of things in order to develop those abilities that were inherently ours. The issue that happens is that traumas of all kinds, you can have spiritual traumas, emotional traumas, physical traumas, and probably a dozen others. But those traumas, when they happen, can, on occasion, not 100% of the time, but they can unlock these conduits of consciousness again for someone, which means now all of a sudden, you are aware of what you're able to sense and feel and hear and understand, perceive, detect, decode, and objectify, all of those things. It starts to happen. It does it in an uncontrolled way. Now, you might, through own self-experimentation or survival, figure out how to use it. maybe to your advantage, many people, it becomes overwhelming. And they it probably borderlines in many cases on just plain schizophrenia, because it is, you're hearing and feeling and sensing, and you didn't ask for it. And now all of a sudden it's there. And why is this here? And I can tell you the conventional psychology would not have, or psychiatry would have absolutely no idea what you were talking about or what you were experiencing. They would think that those that sensory input that was coming to you is something that can be handled by a psychotropic medication, and they would break out the prescription pad and give you something to chemically harness your brain again in that way. So no, what happened to me was I suddenly became aware of something that I didn't know existed, and I then kept that to myself. But the event kind of, or the sense of the event kept coming back at least 3 more times. And that's when I shared that with the command psychiatrist, or psychologist rather, who was at Royal Cape, the activity, the organization called the Secret Army of Northern Virginia. There's a book called Killer Elite that talks about that unit when I was in there. And you get polygraphed when you're there. And then after you get polygraphed, you would sit down. You get routinely polygraphed. And then you would sit down, after you pass, you'd sit down with a psychologist who would then ask you a series of questions. Why? Because he was detailed to keep his finger on the psychiatric pulse of the organization. Why? Because people melt down when they live in that kind of a world, and are, that they can't be truthful with anybody about anything, more or less. So there's a very high divorce rate. There's a very high alcoholism rate. There's just a very high sense of unrest rate in all of those kinds of things, those kinds of organizations. And this guy would always ask this very bizarre question at the end of the meeting. He would say, "Is there anything else you would like to tell me about?" Which I thought was creepy and kind of an open-ended thing. I mean, he asked you the questions, you gave the answers. I'd be like collecting my stuff to get up and go. And you go, no, one more question. Are you sure there's nothing you would like to talk to me about? Which I always thought, like, that's a creepy thing to ask me, because then I'm thinking, what does he know that maybe I
trying to get you to tell on yourself?
Yeah. So I told on myself the second time I went through that, which was then I had told him what happened in the desert of Jordan when I was shot in the helmet by a Jordanian machine gun bullet and what happened there. And then that's when he began what Walter was talking about, this slow and deliberate, limited read on over the next 6 months of just parceling out little bits and pieces. He never used the term remote viewing, and he never really defined what it was. He just wanted to see what my interest level would be in relation to what he was giving me to look at, which was actual, remote viewing sessions that were being done primarily in support of the failed Iranian hostage rescue attempt. They were using remote viewers to help them understand where hostages might be kept in and around the embassy grounds, because few people know this, but they didn't have any blueprints, none. They had no blueprints for the U.S. embassy in Tehran. They had none. They were all in the embassy. So there was no place else at the State Department or anywhere else. Nobody had the blueprints. So nobody knew which way doors opened, where stairways were, and or any of those kinds of things. They had no idea. They relied on 3 sources: HUMINT, Intel, which that was crappy because they were pretty deliberate about making sure that only certain people were there to see that, because they were not stupid. They knew that the U.S. would be trying to find that out. They used the footage that Ted Koppel was filming every night when he was over there interviewing their Revolutionary Guard, and they were always positioning the shot so that they were looking down corridors, right? So they could see stairwells and that thing. So Ted Koppel was witting in his support of that. And they were doing that, and then they were feeding that back to blue light, which was called Delta later. I mean, before they launched it, and they were analyzing it based on that and trying to recreate. And they were using remote viewers. So they were using remote viewers to understand the layout of certain rooms and doors and how they opened. And you actually saw the remote viewers doing some pretty fantastic work for back at that time. I mean, like sketching locks that had Farsi or Arabic on them, and the remote viewers were capturing it as best they could, and that was all being analyzed and interpreted so they could try to figure out what kind of lock it was, who made that lock, and could they cut the lock by blowing it off, or could they get keys made? I mean, all kinds of things were going into that. But looking at all of that was pretty fascinating, and the language being used was intriguing. And because I just didn't balk at those things, that's how they ended up recruiting me into the organization. And I was the first and only ever special operations officer, as a former Ranger Company commander and a former Airborne Company commander. I was the first and only combat arms officer from Special Ops that ever walked through that place. And nobody else ever went through it again. And as I told you before, I think that, I had no intention of staying there. I was only there to learn what I was going to learn, and then I was going to go. I did not stay there for, 10 years of a career or 15 years of a career, and most of those other folks did. I mean, they spent huge chunks of time there. Frankly, I was kind of bored with it by the end of 3 years. I mean, seriously, I was really bored with the whole thing, and I needed to go get back to troops or something. I was no longer interested in that. But what I learned there changed my life. It transformed me, because it took me from the perspective of being a believer in something beyond the physical. And it gave me an absolute irrefutable, undeniable evidence that there's something beyond the physical and that I'm part of it. And that transformation was worth the price of admission and then some. It changed my life completely. And that was really the reason why I chose to write the book Psychic Warrior, because if I was so changed and motivated by becoming awakened and aware and realizing and, reclaiming this understanding of something that had been part of me all my life, albeit I had no idea. I mean, I didn't even know how to spell psychic. I mean, seriously. So I
still got problems with spelling psychic. So, I still not any good at it. But, Walter, I've already asked Dave this question before in a previous interview, and I want to get your input on this because I actually believe that we did talk about it before in our last interview that I had you on. But we know the multi-leveled nature of remote viewing and how it can be used in a myriad of ways, right? CRV, TRV, remote sensing, perturbation of objects, remote influencing. Now, this question is pure speculation, but we know the evolving nature of remote viewing. So if the government, military, and three-letter organizations are still using remote viewers or have some kind of remote viewing program open, now, just to be clear, there's no evidence that any military or three-letter organization has any kind of military or they're using any psychics or remote viewers anymore. But if they did, what would be the application for that program, in your opinion?
The same things that I think David would back up. It would be installations, weapons assessments, readiness, military preparedness of potential enemies and known adversaries. That would be in a military organization application of it, that really would be what it's about. And then of course there would be your subset things with, rescue ops, that kind of thing, but it really would be something military in its nature. In my opinion, from my experience, I was only on active duty 6 years, and that's just from those 6 years. That's what I come away with, is they really are much more focused on more what you'd call traditional military kind of targets than a lot of people in our community like to think. So I think it would come down to that.
It would also be a political.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Politically, economic, industrial espionage. I mean, I always liked Paul Smith's title to his book, seeing into the mind of my enemy, kind of thing. That very mysterious. But that's, that was precisely what was done, that and everything else. But the issue was, when we thought about it in retrospect, when there were huge shredding, there'd be, as soon as somebody got wind that there was going to be an inspector general inspection, right? And you remember those, they were always supposed to be unannounced and secret, and you weren't supposed to know they were coming, but you always mysteriously knew they were coming. And so then everything was being done to, to polish everything up to be ready for the inspector general. And I mean, we didn't have any role in any of that, but when we were told that somebody was coming, then the next thing we would find is we would come in the morning, and Fern and or somebody else out of the DIA would have gone through the file safes that night and pulled files that they did not want the IG to see, and they would shred them and put them in burn bags. I mean, they had a big, Intel commercial shredder right there. They would shred them, put them in burn bags, and you'd come in and there'd be 7, 8, 9, burn bags that'd be laying there on the floor, ready for the burn wagon guy to come pick them up and take them off to incinerate all the intel that was now shredded in those bags. So we started asking ourselves questions like, if that's happening, and it's happening on a fairly routine basis, first of all, just think of the historical data that's being lost. But secondly, why would they be doing that unless we were doing something we weren't supposed to be doing? Right? So while they were developing the, seeing into the mind of my enemy, I think that in more than one case that we didn't know who the customers were, certainly not as remote viewers. We had no idea who the customers were. And if the CIA was involved, who's to say that the CIA wouldn't have been using us to target political enemies,
right?
Whether they were in Congress or Senate or White House or governors or military officers or anything. Who's to say that? Or other agents, suspected double agents. I'm just certain that there was some of that going on.
Sure.
That we were looking at double agents and triple agents, and and that would of course be illegal, but we were doing it. I'm certain of that. I don't know about about the political, about politicians and stuff, but hey, once that line's crossed, I think that, once the gloves are off on something like that, I think it's very difficult for them to start reining themselves in.
Right.
Now the mission creep is in play. And if they got away with it once, then they start doing it more frequently and more frequently. And then who's to say, who decides what they will and will not do? And my only evidence of that is there has to be a reason why those files are being shredded and incinerated. There has to be a reason. It wasn't because they were making space, because they were trying to make space in the safes. So they were shredding them because they didn't want anybody to see it.
Yeah, because if you just need more space, they're just going to bring another safe in.
They'll bring another safe in. Exactly.
Well, I have one more question for each of you, and it's all the same question. I'm going to let you guys go. I appreciate your time this evening. I think it's been a wonderful and fascinating discussion and round table. So, Cathy, do you think that it's possible that MK Ultra is involved with alien abduction, seeing UFOs, being contacted, any of the contactees? I know you mentioned this earlier, but I just want to get some clarification on this and your thoughts and opinions. If it could be possible that MK Ultra is involved in UFO experiencers and contact experiencers.
Absolutely. There's no question that it's used that way. There's so much more possibility though, and MK Ultra, it has its own purposes and directions for control, or to create hysteria, to discredit MK Ultra survivors, or to dilute truth that they don't want people to know. So there's a lot of different ways and reasons that it would be used like that, and not only in the alien direction, but they dilute anything, and take information and distort it to keep people from looking at the truth and realizing, that there is a handful of criminals that have spun off from all the information that may have been intended for other purposes or other directions, but it's definitely gotten into some criminal hands. And we need to realize that and wake up to that reality. Knowledge is our defense against mind control, no matter what theme is being used. And when we have that knowledge, superstition begins where knowledge leaves off. And if people don't have a basis in knowledge, then they'll believe anything, especially if they're looking outside themselves for answers. We have so many answers within ourselves. So, we just need to get the knowledge out there of our mind-brain function, how it responds to trauma, so that we can learn to protect ourselves from manipulation by a dark agenda, or through a controlled media that's misleading us away from the truth that we need to, be experiencing in our lives. We've got to get back to that aspect of it and start living life the way that it was intended to be, freely, with strength of spirit, true to soul, with the capacity to think beyond what we're being indoctrinated with. So, this is a wonderful opportunity to help people realize that and understand. I think the point has been made so well tonight on how information can be taken and used in an adverse way. The information itself is neither good nor bad. It's who has control of it, for what reason. And it's up to us to reclaim our knowledge base of our own mind-brain function, understand how we're responding to traumas around us, and reclaim our free thought. We've got a lot more to discover than what a handful of criminals are trying to lead us to think and believe. We've got endless possibility out there, and a lot of capacity within ourselves, where we don't have to be looking outside ourselves to big government and big tech and all that. We've got, when we look within, we're going to find a whole lot more available than they could ever begin to dream of.
Thanks, Cathy. Dave, what do you think about this? Do you think that the UFOs and aliens are a cover-up for something much bigger?
Well, if you're asking me, you asking me the MK Ultra question, or are you asking me that?
Essentially, that's what it would be, right?
I don't have any reference for MK Ultra other than, what I've read. I'm not a survivor of it and was not part of it. But I will say that I would not be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised about any possibility in terms of how it could have been used or why it would have been used. And I mean, we're only speculating in that respect, but I would not be surprised about anything. It was a program that was motivated by a fear of mind control by other countries. And it was motivated by a genuine desire that not being prepared to answer that with their own version, or at least an understanding of it. And therefore, they were looking at every possibility, rightly or wrongly. And so I wouldn't be surprised about any of it. I really wouldn't.
Walter, I know you got some good thoughts on this.
Well, within the context that you're asking, I think extraterrestrial truth and lies could be very useful to an application of MK Ultra tactics, and I think that has been done to some degree. So, yeah.
Thank you guys so much. Cathy, where can they find you online? Plug your website or where they can purchase your book.
Yeah, all my information is secured on my website at trance-formation.com, trance-formation.com. And I can also be contacted through my website. It's the best way to get the information and to reach me, trance-formation.com.
Thank you. Dave, where can they find you online?
Yeah, the best place to go right now is RV hyphen, what is it? RV hyphen, yeah, RV hyphen forum, FORUM .club. So RV hyphen forum .club. I'll get back to people there. It's not something I check all the time, but that's the best place. If you go to davidmorehouse.com, that website ownership is now in dispute, so probably not where you want to go. And then, yeah, just go to that other website. All my books are on Amazon, along with the audiobooks and the other things that are there. So, okay.
Thank you,
But
Walter.
I've enjoyed it. It's been fun.
Thank you. Walter, where can they find you online, my friend?
Well, my books and links to various things are at lostcontinentlibrary.com. That's my publishing company. But I'm also at the Walter Bosley channel on YouTube, live every Sunday afternoon. And also at the International Broadcast Network, or IBN 24/7. I do a Tuesday night radio show now. So that's where you can find me, those three places.
All the links to everyone's information will be in the description of this video. I very much enjoyed this conversation. Would love to do it again sometime. I think we should do more of these and put more of these out there, because this is really where we get different perspectives of each individual and get their background on all the information. Check out all of their work in the description. For everyone else, thanks for watching and listening. Much love to everyone in the chat. Please be sure to hit the thumbs up button to help the channel and the algorithms. Share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well for notifications. The links to all my information is in the description as well. And remember, we're not only in a spiritual war, but a war on humanity. Stay aware, stay alert, keep loving your heart for everyone, stay safe out there. And if you can see through the illusion, you are the solution. See you guys next time.
See you guys.